Rare earths are a group of 17 elements that can be found in most advanced technologies like electric vehicles, smartphones, wind turbines, and defense systems. And their global supply is largely controlled by China. Its grip on rare earths has left the US, India, and the EU vulnerable. So how is Beijing wielding its strategic leverage in the trade war with the US? And how will that impact critical industries around the world? I'm Divya Gopalan, and this is Connected on Taiwan Plus. To understand China's chokehold on rare earths and why the world economy relies on these elements, I'm joined in the studio by Dimitar Gueorguiev, Associate Professor at the Political Science Department of the Maxwell School of Citizenship and Public Affairs at Syracuse University. Thank you very much for being in the studio with us today.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm grateful to be here.
You know, rare earths are suddenly, it goes through these iterations where it gets talked about, then suddenly fades into the silence. But now it is a huge topic, and for a very good reason. Recently, you've described China's recent restrictions on rare earth exports as a signal of its ability to throttle export or even the supply if the US-China trade war escalates. Can you give us some context to that and explain?
Yeah, no, I think you're precisely right. Now, the on and off interest in the topic is kind of odd because we know that rare earths are really important to all sorts of industries, which we'll get into in just a moment. And we've known about this for a long time, but they peak in the news cycle in terms of when they are certainly scarce and how rare are they. But what I think is happening right now is, as you mentioned, throttling by China. I think it's a signal from China that they are ready, able, and willing to use their leverage, but in a very calibrated and measured way. This is not a full restriction on exports. This is not an embargo, but it is a signal that says we can turn the volume up and down and cause pain or comfort depending on how negotiations proceed. So the signal is proceed in good faith and maybe the pain will be less.
And they have already restricted certain exports to the US. Can you give us an idea of what those exports are and how significant that is?
So the restrictions, they are not full-scale restrictions. I think what China is pursuing now, in contrast to what it had done in the past, where it fully blocked off certain exports, things like germanium and gallium, what they're doing now is requiring Chinese exporters to get licenses to export. And this allows, again, for a more regulated approach to export controls. It also allows the Chinese government to have a little bit more legibility and transparency over exactly where those exports are going. In a way, I think the Chinese have learned from the United States as example of export controls, and where the United States has tried to manage how, let's say, for example, NVIDIA chips that get exported maybe to a third party like Malaysia then end up going to China anyway. Right now, what the Chinese are trying to do is make sure that when they want to put pain on the United States for rare earths, they can manage the firms who are exporting these products directly.
So in essence, playing them at their own game. I wonder, these minerals are so essential in so many of the things we use in so many industries. So how did we come to a point where one country controls about 60% of global rare earth production and 90% of rare earth refining?
Yeah, so this is, I think, this is probably going to be the most important part of our conversation, and hopefully the most important thing your viewers can get out of this conversation is that when we think about China's rise as the dominant player on rare earths, it's not as if somehow the Chinese government or China Incorporated Global went around and bought up all the competitors and tried to dominate the market. No, on the contrary, what they did was invest early, invest big through subsidies, through procurement guarantees from the state to Chinese firms that created a market that wasn't realistic. It was a characteristic kind of overcapacity situation. And what happened was, essentially for the rest of the world, this was an all-you-can-eat kind of buffet-style model for rare earths, where industry around the world could access cheap, abundant, and high-quality rare earths from the Chinese market. And over time, everybody else forgot how to cook their own, and they got rid of their kitchens. And so now we're in a situation where China is, as you put it, dominant, especially in the refining side of rare earths. But again, this has been to the benefit of the rest of the world. Right? That buffet right now is still open. It's still really cheap. It's still really attractive. But what has changed is that the Chinese state now, what I would say is they're taking reservations. So if you want a seat at the table, you have to play nice. And if you criticize China, or if you challenge them on other economic security fronts, you get to wait at the back of the line.
So would you say that China's got to this point of this strategic importance when it comes to rare earths by default, or was there a design behind it? Did anyone expect it, particularly China, to be at this position at some point?
It depends what you consider design. Was there an intent to become a major player, if not a dominant player in this market? Certainly. Deng Xiaoping mentioned in the 1980s that the rest of the world, especially the Middle East, has oil, but China has rare earths. And so if China could invest big and create the incentive structure for Chinese firms to develop these industries, they could really pay off. Now, was that a deliberate attempt to try and create this kind of global dependency on China? I wouldn't go that far. And we have to also acknowledge that China's push towards rare earths has been very costly to the Chinese people, to the Chinese public in terms of health, to the Chinese environment. So it's been a brutal investment, but China is now in a position where it can use this as leverage. But when we think about all of this, we also have to consider that the Chinese are not necessarily winning every play here, because one of the reasons why China's become so dominant is because the prices that firms are charging are way below market value. And it's part of the structure that the state has incentivized through subsidies and through easy cash flow for firms engaged in these businesses, where they don't think about profit, they think about volume. And so is China really benefiting from all of this? Yes, in terms of leverage and kind of geopolitical leverage, but are Chinese firms really making that much kind of actual value? Not so much.
So it's basically a business model and perhaps a scenario that'd be hard to replicate in other countries, given the kind of state strategy that's behind it. Now, China's strategic use of rare earths as a geopolitical tool is not new. And I believe in 2010, Beijing halted exports to Japan, and that did create some kind of disruption in Japan's industries. So why do you think the world really hasn't, or how much has the world looked at that to understand perhaps what China could do with its rare earth advantage?
Well, thank you for bringing that up. I think we should ask kind of what China learned from that experience, as well as what the rest of the world learned. Because what China learned from that experience is that it can use this as a choke point, as leverage. And what resulted, paradoxically, did not push everybody to then worry about overdependency on China. And that's because of the way these kind of restrictions that are often temporary end up manifesting in the market. So they don't come out of nowhere. Firms can anticipate. They try to preempt by stockpiling. That raises the price of these products. That encourages then domestic firms to pressure their governments to find a negotiated solution, and eventually things normalize, prices go down. And so in that process, who wants to then invest in an industry that who knows when a negotiated deal might plummet prices in the future? So it creates this kind of unease and uncertainty that really doesn't encourage domestic investment in these China-dependent markets, China-dependent industries.
Okay, before we continue, I want to look at some of the data out there and look at which countries hold the biggest rare earth deposits and lead global production. According to the U.S., or it's a 2024 U.S. Geological Survey, China leads in rare earth reserves with an estimated 44 million tons. That's followed by Vietnam with 22 and Brazil with 21 million tons. Russia and India are holding 10 million and nearly 7 million tons of rare earth deposits, respectively. But when it comes to annual production in 2024, China produced 270,000 tons of rare earths with The US coming in at a distant second with 45,000 tons of output. Myanmar is in the third spot with an annual production of 31,000 tons, followed by Australia, Thailand, and Nigeria. As you can see, those numbers, it's hard to put all of this in context, but in general, what do those numbers say to you about China's dominance in the market?
What it tells me is that things are not going to change much in the short term or in the medium term. Setting up a new mine, a new extraction point, and then also combining it with some sort of refining capacity can take well over a decade. And without some sort of public guarantees and public financing to make that feasible, normal market actors are not going to jump into this.
Do you think, given now that we've realized, and especially, again, like I said, how attention kind of ebbs and flows on rare earths, is there any impetus now for other countries to think, hey, we've got to pick up production and refining ourselves? Or is there a general environment where people or countries are thinking this will eventually right itself?
No, well, I don't think anybody is naive or optimistic that this will eventually right itself. But at the same time, there's only so much any individual player can do. And so there is a number of efforts, multilateral efforts to try and create, especially amongst buyers, so people who procure, companies who procure, industries who procure these metals, to try and collaborate and coordinate, and when it comes to stockpiling as well, to be able to share stockpiles. And on the rare occasions where you do make new investments in infrastructure and new extraction points, that it is not a one-country effort. But again, these are going to be nominal changes to the overall market, which is still going to continue to be China-dominated.
And speaking of the China-dominated scenario, where, let's just take the EU as an example, just to put it in context. The European Union relies on China for 98% of its rare earth magnets, and that's used in auto components, fighter jets, medical imaging devices, amongst other very critical pieces of technology there. So what happens when if China decides to turn off the taps?
Well, if China decides to turn off the taps is a very important if. And I don't think we have a reason to believe that China wants to turn off the taps, especially not indefinitely. As a negotiation tactic, as leverage, perhaps. But turning off the taps entirely, I think, would be self-defeating for China as well. Because even at the moment, even with China's rush towards the green energy transition, towards their kind of policy mandated transition to electrified vehicles, even then, capacity in China exceeds demand. And so they need the rest of the world to offload this product. And so on an indefinite turning off of the tap, I don't think is likely. It's about managing those short-term disruptions, making sure that it is not done on a one-to-one bilateral type of negotiation with the Chinese, which is what they would like to do, but a multilateral pushback against these types of interruptions. I think that is much more meaningful than trying to somehow displace China. And again, it would be very costly to do so. We have to remember that, right? The world benefits right now from this China-centered market, where China is suffering a lot of the externalities of this production. It's a dirty, expensive, messy process. The counterfactual would be much more expensive technology, much slower innovation. So I don't think that that's necessarily in the outlook.
Yeah, the U.S. is taking steps to secure alternative sources and perhaps even somewhat put some muscle behind its own industry. What does that look like right now? Is it making any headway?
Yes, but again, only on the margins. So there's a few projects, Mountain Pass and a neighboring new potential extraction point in California. These are going to produce some critical rare earths if they come into production that are especially important for the defense sector. But even with public financing and subsidies, these projects are not really going to be very market competitive. So they're going to be small areas of production. I think what the United States is hoping to do is also develop other more innovative ways of extracting rare earths from existing extraction points. For instance, in some of the coal mining industry along the East Coast, you can take some of the byproducts of that industry and then look for rare earths in there, which may be less resource intensive. But again, these are only going to be on the margins.
What other countries can even come close to giving China a run for its money as far as rare earth deposits go?
I think the main players are probably the Australians. They have, in terms of extraction technology and refining capability, they're probably the most advanced. They, I think, are quite active domestically, but also internationally. And they're competing with the Chinese in some third-party locations like Malaysia to try and extract those resources and process them.